For our last session, so we're going to now pivot a bit. We've been talking about risk and opportunity all day, and we've been talking about what the big opportunities are that are being driven by climate change. We wanted to create a panel which is specifically focused on highlighting what some of those innovations are, what the opportunities are, what the scale of those potential opportunities are, and what are the barriers and solutions to overcome some of those barriers. So I'm really excited to have the panelists that we have here to share some of the work that they're doing on this front. I'll let them do their introduction, so I'm going to turn it over to the panel to get started. So welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. So in a way, what we'll do is hopefully kind of complete the arc that started last evening. We got kicked off by Scott Jacobs, and part of his big message was we don't need innovation. We've got all the technologies that we need. We just need a lot of project finance and projects and put it in the ground. But you know, he loves to be provocative. The plain fact is that if we were to implement every tool that we have in our toolkit today to the full extent that we could, we'd be many, many gigatons short of what we need to get on a path of decarbonization and adaptation that would avoid really dramatic disruption of ecosystems and the economy and society. And actually, Scott acknowledges that. We founded a company, a fintech company, to help guide capital to not only to deployment, but also to a range of different new technologies and new business models that are going to be ready to scale up at a commercial level in the next 5 to 10 years. Scott cited the Bloomberg New Energy Finance stat yesterday. Only 6% of the clean energy finance last year went to innovation or was in venture. That may be true, but the rejoinder to that is over the next decade, many of those, not all, but many of those technologies are going to provide opportunities for hundreds of billions of dollars of incremental project finance, making those things scale up. So in talking about those opportunities, we've got a terrific panel here that's able to discuss this, and not just talking about big moonshot types of innovations, but also the kinds of incremental innovations or innovations that are combining in a new way some existing technologies that can have massive impact and create huge value for companies and investors. So what we're going to do is start out with telling you guys a little bit, a couple of minutes each, about the firms that our panelists come from, and then we'll get into some questions that we've teed up in advance. But then, in case I forget to remind you as we get into this, make it a conversation. You should be part of the conversation, and just go up to that mic in the back. I'm sure you all have plenty of questions. So Victoria, you've got ties to the area as a UNC grad before doing your MBA and MS in environment at Stanford. So welcome back.
Thank you.
And you're also part of a VC that, for those of you all that don't know, Prelude is widely regarded as one of the premier players in this space. So if you'd tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. Based in San Francisco, Prelude Ventures is a venture fund. We invest largely, broadly rather, in the low carbon economy. So we have in our portfolio companies you'd expect. We have solar companies, energy storage companies. We've also invested in mining technology, agriculture, food, transportation, and it kind of goes on from there. Our view is that we need technologies that can scale, and in doing so, reduce atmospheric carbon. Happy to talk more about specific investments, but thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Thanks, great. So Mark, you also have ties to UNC and Duke as a Robertson Scholar, and then now more recently as a member of the board of the Nicholas Institute, which if you all are not familiar with that, take a look. It's a really great, the Nicholas Institute for Policy Solutions. You're back here now and have founded a private equity firm here in Durham that invests in and through businesses that distribute in distributed energy innovations to market. So we'd love to hear about modern energy.
Sure thing. Sort of as you described, modern energy is focused on investing in developers that are bringing new energy technologies to scale. And we really focus on where there's a technology that may have proven itself out only in a proof of concept, but where the technology has been at least materially de-risked, but where it's not reaching penetration in the market, usually because some kind of business model innovation is needed. And we get excited about working with developers, but to figure out what that business model should be, and then drive asset finance capital through that model to try and bring the technology to scale.
Terrific. And Bill, who just told me he has traveled 300,000 miles in the air over the last year, and his average speed per waking minute is at 100 miles an hour. We're glad that he's come to rest here for a few moments. He's got not only a JD from Duke, but after many years doing corporate law and some really interesting innovation in financial services and other areas in New York, returned to teach at our law school here. Then you said about creating 8 rivers, and I'm excited for you all to hear about this because it's a really unique model and very exciting. So if you take a couple of minutes to tell us about it, including how a space launch company is relevant to climate change.
Yeah, 8 Rivers was put together by myself and a friend of mine from MIT. We went to MIT together. He stayed on the straight and narrow for science and math and continued to get his PhD in chemistry and worked during the 80s on the Star Wars programs for the Defense Department. He's created a lot of weapons systems. Meanwhile, I did law a little bit and then went into finance. And in 2007, I got together with Miles in New York City and said, Miles, you've been creating weapons of mass destruction. I've been creating weapons of financial destruction. Why don't we do good for a change? And so we got together and brought the innovation and the finance experience together to solve some of the world's big problems. And we start out, we're a strange company in that we're a mini Bell Labs with a commercialization arm. We develop our own stuff internally. We invest internally. So when we call ourselves 8 Rivers Capital, we think that capital comes in 3 forms: financial, intellectual, and human. And each one of those is equally important to the overall equation. And so generally, as we look at the world's problems and think that if domain experts could solve the world's problems, they would all be solved because there's no shortage of domain experts. And so we start from the proposition that people are focused on incremental stuff rather than over the horizon stuff, and we try to hire and bring together people for innovation. So one of the things that we work on is space launch, where Miles called me up in the middle of the night about 3.5 years ago, and he said, Bill, I figured out what I did wrong on railguns. And I won't explain railguns here, but railguns are a way of launching projectiles anywhere in Earth or into orbit. And he called me at 2 o'clock in the morning and said, Miles, why are you telling me now? I said, well, Bill, if I die in the next 6 hours, I want someone to know. And so that's our relationship. So as a result, we're working on a technology that will put satellites into space, into orbit, at 90% less cost than what Elon charges. And that's just for the first launch. Why? Because we don't launch the fuel in the rocket, but we just launch the projectile. This could also be for logistics on suborbital, but we work on a lot of things. We work on energy, space launch, telecommunications, hydrogen production, ethylene production, things like that.
Great. One of the things that is a common denominator for all the firms is energy. And I know there was a great energy panel earlier, but just to build on that panel, what are the most important innovations that are happening in energy and electric power? How big a market is it for the companies that you all are looking at, and how quickly can these innovations scale up? Do you want to start?
Sure. Number of interesting things going on. The first thing that comes to mind is demand response, which is not necessarily a new technology, but is being applied, I think, in innovative ways. And as the grid gets more distributed, and as we have more solar assets in particular creating a peaky demand supply equation, then there's room for major energy users to play into markets. I was here earlier for many of the carbon pricing discussions. Absent the price on carbon, there are lots of ways for large industrial players to monetize their ability to turn on and off loads. And so we've invested in a couple companies that are doing that. In really interesting geographies. We have one company, demand response company, whose customer is a coal plant. You don't necessarily think of it, but a coal plant actually has a large load. And so I think we will continue to see interesting partnerships develop as we transition into this new energy landscape.
Yeah, that's one of the themes that we've heard come up is not just focusing on the low carbon industries, but improving the carbon profile of the fossil fuel industry. Yeah.
Building on that a little bit and a little bit related, I think a lot of attention's been paid today to decarbonization of generation, and there's a lot of exciting things happening with demand response. But one of the other things that could begin to happen if we continue to see cost reductions in generation and overall sort of grid electricity is other industries moving onto the grid that are currently powered by something else, right? They're powered by combustion, or they're powered through some other means. And we're really excited about ways that you can end up seeing migration in cost of aluminum because of reduced cost of power that mean that aluminum is the least cost resource for a given application when it's not today. And there's some sort of interesting ways that the economics of other industries that we don't necessarily associate with electric power today get affected by low carbon, low cost electricity.
Yeah, and that's for those of you that are not energy focused, one of the ways that that all this stuff is going to touch you, electrification is one of those trends within a mega trend that is enormous. And so even if you're not an energy major or going to go into this field, it's very likely that electrification is going to touch an industry that you're involved in. And now to what may seem like a science project, but in fact it's happening.
It's happening, yeah. We started out building this one company called Net Power, and the result is, and we started out with the belief that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with any particular fuel source or intrinsically good about any particular fuel source. The question is how you impact the environment. So let's face it, we don't generally think of water unless you're in Houston during a hurricane, or 1 inch of water is bad if you're unconscious and face down. So water in the wrong place is really bad. Well, CO2 is not a bad thing. In fact, it's just in the wrong place. And so we start with that proposition. We built this whole technology in Net Power that allows us to produce electricity from natural gas and coal at prices that are comparable to, and when you throw everything else in, are much cheaper than existing power sources. Imagine this. Imagine a normal natural gas power plant. Won't go into my assumptions, but I assume $3 gas and a bunch of other things. A normal natural gas power plant will produce electricity at 4.6 cents per kilowatt hour. Our first plant will be able to produce electricity at 2.6 cents and do it 24/7, 365, and capture 100% of the carbon. So therefore, we've got a big way of changing the way we think about intermittency. We partner extremely well with renewables. If we have 100%, we have zero carbon impact, they have zero carbon impact. In fact, for those of you who understand the energy world, our heat rate, after you take our CO2 sales and our argon sales, our heat rate's zero. That's unheard of. People think heat rates of zero only happen to renewables because the energy is free. So we've got a plant down in Houston right now. It's 30 miles southeast of Houston. Our partners are Exelon, which is one of the largest power corporations in the United States, Chicago Bridge and Iron, and 8 Rivers Capital. We also had technology partners of many people, including Toshiba. But if anybody from here ever wanted to do a field trip down there, we'd love to have you, and we'd love to show you what it looks like to basically produce electricity at a price that allow the world to meet every single climate target without having to pay more for electricity.
And one of the things that is, and I think I'm right on this, correct me if otherwise, Bill, is that what sounds like this breakthrough that is all some vast new technology is largely a re-engineering and combination of existing technologies. Is that right?
Yeah, it's sort of we took various Lego blocks and we just put them together in a different order because the world just didn't think the Lego blocks would work that order. We can spend a lot of time on the technology of it, but it's pretty fascinating. And if you Google it, you should also Google alum cycle. We've had probably for 6-7 years, many PhD students die on their theses of trying to prove that we are impossible. And all they do is end up confirming it so.
So let's look beyond energy and talk about some of the categories that are promising in other sectors. So tell me about examples of technologies or companies that you think are most exciting in IT, food and ag, water, transportation, buildings. And not just, to the extent that there's a adaptation or resilience angle, I think it's worth mentioning, but mostly we're going to focus on mitigation.
Start?
Do you want to start?
You
Go
can
for it.
start if you want to go a different direction. Either way. I can go. Transportation is somewhere that I've spent a lot of time in the last year. Depending on how you look at the numbers and what geography, it represents anywhere between 1/3 and half of greenhouse gas emissions. Domestically, we have a lot of things going on that are in some ways different than what's going on internationally. But to the point Truman was making about the electrification of everything, that's an obvious one. There's a lot of talk about electrification of fleets. Actually, can I do a poll? I'm actually really curious about this.
Yep.
Who here owns or leases an electric car? Okay. So that's about what I expected. I think we have a long way to go on that. I think there's tremendous opportunity. However, there's some kind of shockingly sticky sticking points, not the least of which is charging infrastructure. So for all of you who are thinking about where to go spend the next few years of your life, I would make a plug for, no pun intended, for you guys to think about going and solving charging issues. All of that context said, there's some really compelling business models and technology innovation that we've seen lately. I don't think we'll make this investment, but there are some interesting swapping business models back to Better Place, but Better Place 2.0 at an order of magnitude lower cost. There are some interesting public-private partnerships that are in the works between utilities and government officials and fleet owners. So interesting things going on there. In addition, there's obviously the autonomous transformation. The verdict is out there. Whether or not that will be positive or negative for climate. There's some evidence that vehicle miles traveled are going to increase. The hope, obviously, is that if we're doing that in an electric form, then we can control in a more gated fashion the emissions. But lots of rich learning to be had and innovation to be had in both of those spaces.
I think one of the things that we get excited about is, and actually worry about is which order automation and electrification happen in transportation. The real risk is that you end up with driverless vehicles that run on fossil fuels and keep driving around all the time emitting. If you can do both at the same time, that can end up being an answer to the charging question, because you can have a lighter transportation charging infrastructure because you have autonomous vehicles that can get back to those charging stations. And so we've been asking questions about what the built environment looks like for charging in a world where potentially automation happens at the same time. Another area that is sort of indirectly affected by, or indirectly affects energy, but I think is generally thought of as technology today, is the sort of smart home and the transition to more and more connected devices, whether it's in your workplace or in your house, means that those devices can be dispatched remotely. And there's ways that can have pretty meaningful implications for how we think about managing the grid, where a bunch of sources of consumption or demand that we historically assumed were static or immutable, that we couldn't influence or control, become cost effectively changeable. And especially as we potentially reduce our ability to control when we're producing power as we move to more renewables, the ability to begin to increase our ability to manipulate when we consume power can end up becoming really, really important to looking at how to keep a reliable, sustainable grid.
Someone said something really clever about Facebook recently. I wish I'd said it. It says, if the product is free, you're the product, right? Your data is the product. And the reason I mention that is I think we are at 8 Rivers, we're trying to get to a point where we drive down energy costs so much that we actually, with all of these interconnected devices, that's information that can be sold. Now, whether we want to sell it or not is, who knows? But if people want to be the product, we see a world where you can ultimately get to the point where by being the product, you won't pay anything for power. We think it can be that cheap. Now, how do you get there? How do you get to that sort of world? Obviously, electricity is one of them, but the other thing that if you talk to Toyota will tell you that they make more batteries for vehicles than any other company in the world. They're the big battery car company, although they happen to be hybrids. They will also tell you that their hybrids are a halo product. It is not their goal. Their goal is hydrogen. Hydrogen is amazing. And one of the things we're working on, we see line of sight for, is we think that you can take the carbon that is in the ground and you can strip the hydrogens off of that carbon and you can make cheap hydrogen. You can make hydrogen at roughly about $1.50 a kilo. The reason people use kilo is because that roughly translates into a gallon of gasoline in terms of range and the like for a car. Well, imagine if you had hydrogen at $1.50, imagine what that world looks like. How do you make hydrogen? We're looking at different ways of making hydrogen that way. We're looking at ways of, if I strip the protons off of the carbons and throw the carbons back into the ground and take the protons off and use them for hydrogen, I can take, by the way, I'll take some of those carbons and make ethylene or propylene, highly imported plastics. So when we look at this world, this is a world of chemistry and power, and it's all interrelated. And the problem historically that we've had is that people in their minds and in their companies are siloed. We think of power companies, we think of chemical companies, we think of oil and gas companies. And when we put our net power projects together, we're having to strip it out because no one knows how to deal with the entire lot. So we'll give the power components to one person, we'll give the CO2, the argon, the nitrogen to someone else, we'll get the hydrogen to someone else. But it requires stepping back and thinking of using and these are really existing technologies, using existing technologies, what could this world be? Because if the difference between where we are today and where we could be tomorrow is mere implementation and an expense speed bump, we're all for it.
Yeah. And so 2 things just to highlight there in what you said. One is we're talking mostly about technology in the panel, but business model innovation is happening in very important ways. So that's a thing to look at. Bill, you mentioned hydrogen. So those of you that are familiar with the energy sector kind of know that hydrogen is the next big thing and always will be. But there is some indication actually that we are actually close to the delivery of what Bill's talking about. A lot of hydrogen that's available for a lot of uses across the economy, not just for powering transportation and power generation, but other purposes at a low-cost way that could scale quickly, including there's a very exciting technology coming out of RTI, the Research Triangle Institute just down the road. So just a couple of things to look at there.
Truman, could I jump in? I know one of our goals for this panel was to kind of stretch the thinking, and your comment, Bill, about Facebook brought up for me something that we're spending a lot of time thinking about, which is in some ways related, in some ways not related to the topics we've been discussing, and that is data and the energy cost of data. As we think about how it's gotten to be so easy for us to take photos on our phone and for us to digitize everything in our personal lives, and industries are talking about the digital transformation, there is just a massive amount of data being created. And if you look at the projections of that, the projections are continued to show a continued increase. That comes at an energy cost. It comes at a cost of moving that data around. It comes at a cost of the computing power required to run simulations and everything else we do. And then it also comes at a cost of storing the energy. So as you all are thinking about, again, ways to use your careers, I think that is kind of on the forefront of where we see some interesting innovation. And frankly, I think, I will speak for myself, I don't think until I started looking at it, I appreciated just what a big current problem it is, but also how that issue is going to define, I think, the next 10 years or so. So off topic, but hopefully hopefully stretches the thinking.
Well, and then there's a flip side to that, and that is the role of IT and data science in all this discussion. And I mean, I'm sure, as you guys heard in the deep dives, it's one of those cross-cutting things. You can't you can take it as a single industry issue if you're thinking about the carbon footprint and how you manage the footprint around storage and computing. But when you think about it from a solution standpoint, it's enormous. And I know it's relevant to portfolio companies for Prelude, to actually how you guys do your private equity investments.
Totally. If I build on that, I think one of the stories that actually hasn't been talked about a ton in the last couple of days is that we have seen increasing energy productivity in the United States, essentially since the recession, right? So we've seen a decoupling of GDP and energy consumption in a way that doesn't really have a precedent in quite a long time. And I think there's an argument that some of that is because as we've increased our expenditure on both generating and processing data, we've been able to gain efficiencies in other places. And so I mean, there's ways in which I'm really excited about the ways in which we've gotten better at both capturing and making good use of information, because that's what's been able to drive a lot of the efficiency gains that we've seen over the last few years, and drive that decoupling of economic production and gains. And efficiency gains. And so the other thing that we've been really interested in this space is that part of what that transition or that reduction in the cost of generating and moving information around has meant is transaction costs that historically made markets not work, in everything from matching people who had spare rooms in their houses to people who needed a place to stay, people who had spare seats in their cars to people who wanted to get somewhere, is that as we get better at both generating and making use of information, markets become possible where they were in a state of market failure before because the transaction costs were too high. And the reason I bring this up is that one of the things we're really excited about is if you imagine that there's actually a lot of energy resources in the world that are dormant right now, they're uncaptured. There's theoretical energy value of moving the time that we cool this building around, or the time that we produce or consume electricity for a given purpose. And before, the buyers and sellers of that energy couldn't actually engage in trade because the cost of finding one another was too high. It made the deal not worth it. And so as we see the cost of both generating information and using it get cheaper, suddenly a bunch of theoretical energy resources that are sitting out in the ether can become valuable, because the cost of matching buyers and sellers finally becomes viable.
That's a great point.
Any want to build on that one? Okay. So one of the, I mean, I think you always, when you think about big drivers of the carbon footprint in the news today is blockchain, and there's a lot of hype around it. So you know, is the hype worth it when it comes to this issue? Are there really important near-term applications that we could see in the climate space related to blockchain?
I can go. So we've talked to a number of companies who are doing blockchain for something, and I would say I've seen a bifurcation in those companies. They're the companies that are using blockchain to solve a fundamental issue that is well aligned for blockchain, and then there are companies who are using blockchain and trying to find a problem that fits to use blockchain, if that makes sense. I'll focus on the former because I think it's more interesting, and I'll share an anecdote. I had a conversation a few weeks ago with Maersk, the big shipping and logistics company. Their head of digital, I think their chief digital officer is what they call him, and he was sharing that they're thinking through some pilots with other large data providers, IBM and the like, about how can we use this, what could be a really powerful technology, but stay in the realm of applying it to problems that are well aligned. And so the example he gave is that right now there's a port in Europe and a port in the US that they're running some experiments on. For some cargo, the bill of lading, which is the document that says what's in the container and where it's going, where it's been, et cetera, it's a physical sheet of paper. In some cases, that bill of lading for a container that is being shipped across the ocean, the bill of lading is flown on an airplane. Now, that doesn't make any sense for a whole bunch of reasons, to your efficiency comment, for energy reasons. What's driving that in part is that transparency and traceability is paramount with this bill of lading. And so this is an example to me where blockchain at its root can provide some of that transparency in a really effective way. And so, you know, there's still a lot of things that need to be figured out, and we're not even talking about the energy implications of the blockchain, which is a whole other discussion. But that to me is an example where you have this fundamental issue, this business issue, where there is inefficiency that can be solved from a distributed ledger in this case. I'll stop there, but that to me is the best example I've seen. Other examples are also in supply chain with produce tracking. Walmart's doing some interesting things there.
Yeah, one of the things that kind of to think about the trend that to look at there is another angle is we haven't talked a lot about emerging markets in this in the whole conference, and so one of the things that is a barrier to climate capital flowing to solutions and adaptation and resilience in a lot of emerging markets, it are these chain of custody types of questions, and so that holds a lot of promise, and is a space to watch in a range of sectors, food and ag, but finance and new financial models is something to look at there. I do want to, we've only got about 5 minutes or so left, so if you've got questions, and I see one there, go ahead.
So thanks. Actually, your last comment was a good segue to my question. I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about how innovation can support access to energy in developing markets or otherwise. If you see major breakthrough in off-grid solutions, if yes, what are the main drivers, and if not, what are the main impediments for that?
I'm happy to go. We have a portfolio company called PowerHive that is building microgrids in sub-Saharan Africa, primarily in Kenya right now. I also worked at D-Light for a while before business school, so intimately affiliated with what's going on. I'm glad you brought up the question because I think there was a lot of hype, call it 5 to 7 years ago, about how big of a market this was and how ripe it was for innovation, and lots of talk about these markets leapfrogging traditional generation assets and distribution. And I would say that we've seen a lot of progress and a lot of promise, but there are still some fundamental issues that need to be solved. I am incredibly hopeful that we will get there, but there is a flow of capital that we need. And there are still some real challenges when it comes to consumer credit, actually. We're finding that that's one of the big barriers, because you need, just like here, you need capital to finance whether it's rooftop solar for your house or large-scale solar. And the way we can do that here is either with FICO scores or some other means of assessing credit. When you have, millions of consumers who have never had a credit card and in many cases not a bank account, it's very difficult for lenders, even patient capital and even philanthropic capital, to figure out how to play in that space. And so there's some interesting tactics being used to create kind of a credit score in the absence of FICO and others. But my hope is that there will still be a lot of interest in this space, because I think we have a long way to go, even though we've made great progress.
I think I just note, or building on that, and I think Victoria's expertise will be deeper than mine on solar home systems, other than to say that I think, similar to what I described before, I think business model innovation is really the critical next step to being able to get solar home systems out into the field. And we have technology that's viable if you can figure out a way to deliver it to the consumer and get sufficiently reliably paid. One of the other things that I think we're spending a little less time on now, at least in terms of the rhetoric, is just grid extension. In other words, there's ways that we can extend grid electricity to more people, and we're getting better at building out grids more efficiently and effectively with microgrid technologies and the like. And I'm hopeful that we'll see more capital flows and frankly, more new people joining the ranks of thinking about how we deliver grid electricity to more people, because I think that's an area pretty ripe with potential that we are not spending as much time on right now.
Great. Next question.
Yeah, so last night, Scott Jacobs talked about how traditional venture capital models are difficult to apply to a lot of the things that we're talking about around these amazing new technologies that all of you are really on the cutting edge of as you learn more about them, decide to invest in them or build them in some cases. So I'm interested in the different perspectives on the panel on what type of venture capital model or even private equity model is well suited for the kind of technologies that we're talking about.
Well, I want to extend your question also to the extent that you guys want to comment on it. What blended models, what kind of new models that use concessional or impact funding and that sort of thing?
The venture capital model works really well for what it works really well at. And it used to work before 2000, the year 2000. It used to work on these sorts of technologies. But with the advent of cheaper and cheaper computing power, it became a lot easier to do this, do a model that focuses on multiple investments and looks for the winners, as opposed to the old VC model, which was taking the table scraps from company R&D efforts and taking a few people out of those corporations and to go build a new company. That was the old VC model. It doesn't exist anymore. And so what we at 8 Rivers try to do is really rehabilitate that old model. Is how do we find, how do we occupy a space that VCs hate? That's long lead times and capital intensive, and the way we do that is we look for strategic partners. So in this one technology, we've got Exelon and CB&I and Toshiba, and we also did not go into the middle of the company. Because if you went into the middle of the company through their VCR and we say, hey, we've got this technology, it'll allow you to produce all the world's energy at no extra cost and capture all the CO2, they thought we were nuts. And so for something very, very bold, you have to go to the CEO level or the C-suite of the company. And so each one of those, our entry point in every single company is at the C-suite, because the C-suite person can look over the horizon. Now the benefit of having these strategics, as they're called, is this. The benefit of having the strategics is that they can solve two problems that plague all startups. One is product market mismatch. I think my idea is great, but the market may not like it at all. But because they're the customer, they're going to tell you whether it's a viable idea or not, and they're going to solve that product market mismatch problem. The second thing that they do really, really well is execution. So when we were doing our power plant, we were doing control systems. We got nuclear control people from Exelon, gas system control people from Exelon. We got all these experts on a just-in-time basis. So I look at our employees. By doing this model, we have just-in-time inventory of brilliance.
So we could go with this as a very rich topic. I think that's a great point to end on when it comes to thinking about the choices that you guys are making going forward as students. Don't think about innovation as just moonshots. Don't think about it as just a VC thing. Realize that that some of the greatest innovation is going on within these very large industry players and across all industries. So thanks so much to the panel. This was a terrific conversation.
Yeah.